which we did in part with a mortgage, so we had to pay a mortgage for 4 years before we finally got it developed and open and running. And that was really my sort of introduction to managed workspace. And as part of that, we went and looked as a board of trustees and I as a member of staff at a variety of other managed workspaces around the country. And because we had funding through ACF, there were a number of other organisations who were also doing managed workspace projects who we were talking to. And following this, I was asked by ACF in round 2 if I would support All Saints Action Network in the development of their old school as managed workspace. There seemed to be a popular option, this old schools and managed workspace. And Asan have finally just got that open, although I have to say that it's morphed a little bit in the current economic climate, and the managed workspace element is actually quite small, that project. And from there I went on continuing to look at managed workspace, and about a year and a half ago did a piece of work with Paul Davis, who some of you may know, who runs Clown Enterprises, looking at managed workspace in the market towns across the East Midlands. Now that piece of work is virtually complete. It's almost ready to be written up into a proper document, and that's really the resource that Paul and I used to produce this balanced scorecard that you see in front of you, and that's where that work came from. I think it's an interesting time at the moment for managed workspace projects with the downturn in the economic climate, and I think I'd be a lot less bullish about recommending it at the moment, although I have got 3 or 4 ACF business development clients that I'm working with at the moment who are all looking at it. So I hope that's a bit of background. I see Yao says, are we going to watch the video? Yes, please. Let's go away and do that, and then perhaps we can come back and have some questions. Is that okay?
Absolutely fine. I did put the link up in the chat box. Let me just put it up there again, and people can follow that, and we'll watch that and then join back here. Chris, I just noticed you said you can't see the balanced scorecard. Do you have nothing in your on the whiteboard to the right of the screen? Very odd. Can I suggest that we all go and watch the video and then come back, and Chris will try and work out why it is that you can't see anything. That's rather strange.
Did anyone have a difficulty with the film where it suddenly stopped? Because I think something to do with presenting. Vicky, you may know this, but while I was watching it, it was saying you are presenting. And I clicked to get rid of that, and it may have been that somehow, as a moderator, you followed me, or some people followed me. Leslie, what was that? Did you get to see the film?
No, I couldn't see it at all.
Not even the beginning of it, when you clicked on and wrote in DTA, and I think click play. Did you see a little bit of it or none at all?
No, it just said my session had expired and then just disappeared.
I think Tawanda had exactly the same error message, so we'll look into this. I think generally we do use YouTube, which seems to be a bit simpler. One of the things I've found is quite useful is having it all set up and ready to go before we go to watch it. So rather than when we're sitting here then following the link, perhaps having it open in a window so you can just press play, and I found that makes things a little bit easier.
I got the same error message about my session had timed out, but I just continued to press OK and or whatever it was I had to press, and I watched it.
I think a message to us all not to be confused or frightened by technology, but to insist that we're in charge. I'm sorry if people weren't able to watch it this morning. I hope you have all had a chance to watch it before, and if not, I would say it's 5 minutes. Do take some time to go and watch it after this session. It'll be on the site for a while, so there'll be some time for you to watch it anyway. I'm going to hopefully assume that everyone's back and clear the ticks from our names, and suggest to Rachel that if you'd like to spend perhaps a couple more minutes raising any points you think weren't raised, and then we'll have some chance to ask some questions. After a few minutes of questions, I'm going to send everyone to breakout rooms. There are 3 breakout rooms. One of them will be lucky enough to have Rachel in it, and we'll spend about 15 minutes or so asking some questions, having some more detailed discussion in a smaller group. And I'm going to ask someone in the breakout rooms to make some notes on a page that's already there, and we'll do our best to have those ready for us when we come back to the main session. Rachel, if there's a few words now that you'd like to say, I'm going to move back to your balanced scorecard.
Yes, Vicky, thanks very much. I have to remember the right button to click. I put my hand up instead of clicking the microphone. Apologies. I think for me, the challenge is that a year on into the credit crunch, the workspace is still reasonably well occupied. We lost one of our bigger tenants in February, and we haven't managed to replace in the larger unit. We lost a couple of the smaller tenants, smaller units, but we were able to fill those pretty much quickly. We had people waiting for those. So I think this is the kind of challenge that we all face with this at the moment. It is still washing its face, it is still being used, and I would absolutely agree that now is the right time to be developing something new. So I think in planning and looking forward to be ready to come out of the recession. And certainly again for us, although properties are moving again on our high street, there's plenty of stuff around that Ibstock could be looking at to redevelop. I think what we saw when we did the research is that for many organisations, although like our managed workspace, the first project that you do often isn't big enough to be sustainable completely by itself. It serves as a useful catalyst and helps organisations to move on. And certainly in the case of Ibstock, what it has provided is, assuming that it doesn't become completely empty, sufficient income to sustain that kind of core admin function of the trust that frees up resources to go and do other things. Again, I'm not sure what you want me to sort of say about the balanced scorecard. It sort of shows this kind of pattern that we saw in the trusts where, and I mean Eckington, if any of you ever get the chance to have a look at Eckington, are a prime example of this, where they did a very tiny little development first, have then done phase 2, and are now well on into the throes of phase 3. And it's sort of that movement of taking that first step of development that perhaps by itself isn't sustainable, but allows you and gives you the experience and the confidence to move on.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks very much. I see Jess has got her hand up. I'm going to suggest that there's some time now before we move to the breakout rooms to ask a few questions to Rachel here. Jess, over to you.
Rachel, that was a very interesting description, having heard your presentations at Ibstock before, and it gets more and more interesting. What I find is really good about this balanced scorecard and the way you're talking about it now is that it's very much about a development process. And I was interested that there weren't any dates in the now, soon and later. Obviously each one is different, but I like the idea that you take on a project and get to practice, to learn and to begin to build some income base and then move on to the next. What kind of timescales do you think we are talking? What's the range of timescales for the process that you're describing?
Our experience when we looked at everybody was that the first project often takes a considerable amount of time, and that is just simply the project identification, that phase that you go through of looking at feasibility, doing the market testing, discovering what kind of mix of space that you might need in that project, whether it's sustainable, as ever, persuading investors with that first project is often the hardest thing, to get your capital package together. And usually you're dealing with a building that has problems, and therefore just getting your permissions to go ahead is a challenge as well. And I have to say that 2 to 3 years is not unusual, and 4 to 5 is quite common. So that first project isn't going to be a quick win. That development process does seem to speed up as people get more experienced, and I think that it's much easier to go and persuade somebody to make the second investment in you than that first one.
Rachel, just to say that James typed a question into the text box saying, do you think the space was a catalyst in the business startup in the first place, and also flagging up where the enterprise culture came from? I wonder if you wouldn't mind answering her one, and then we'll move on to Annette.
Yes, I think that what we found was that having that very first small space, i.e. the community shop, which we ran as a one-stop shop, and particularly because we were working with local businesses, we were talking to them all of the time about their space needs. And what we found was that we had a number of businesses that were in really quite inadequate space. And although there's a lot of empty space around us, it really needs development to make it suitable for use for today's sort of office come sort of very light industrial type space, which is what we've got in the school. And what we had were an awful lot of empty shop fronts, and the market isn't bullish enough in Ibstock, and has never been bullish enough in Ibstock to invest in the redevelopment of those spaces. So I think that's really the challenge, and it was the way in which we were working early on which allowed us to have the confidence that there was demand and market out there. I think what makes us successful is that we were not afraid to go for quality, and that really is the difference.
Rachel, Annette, whose microphone doesn't seem to be working too well either, has also asked a question in the chat box, wanting to know what legal form the organisation took. You can see the rest of that yourself.
Yes, as Ibstock Community Enterprises Limited was set up by primarily local independent business people, they were very wary of being a charity. And so when they first began to explore what legal form they might adopt, they went to the local cooperative development agency and had invaluable support from them about this, and created a company limited by guarantee with a cooperative structure. Now this has allowed us to be recognised as having mutuality, because we have a membership that's open to everybody, and we trade amongst the members, and this gives us a certain tax advantage, not a complete tax advantage. We still have to pay capital gains tax, but we don't pay corporation tax. The structure that we came up with was a fully elected committee. There are no reserved places for anybody. We can have up to 16 people on the committee at any time, although 13 of those are elected, and there are 3 places available for co-option if the organisation wants it. It's very, very rare that we've ever had all 13 places fully occupied. It's interesting that our local politicians have wanted to join the organisation and be on the committee, and so although not the case because we've just been through some local government elections which have changed the landscape quite significantly, at one point we had our MP, our county councillor, one of our 3 district councillors and 2 parish councillors, all as elected members of the committee, having stood for election and been elected by the membership. We have a 3-tier local government situation out here. We've got parish, district and county council, and at various times over our 13 years history we've had different kinds of relationships with all 3 levels of local government. I would say that of them all we have a better relationship with our parish council and our district council than we do with the county, who, although they were very keen with us in the days when we were setting up, have become much more remote over the years. In terms of the development of this project, our district council were particularly helpful because they have a long tradition of owning and managing workspace themselves, and they provided us with a free demand study and an awful lot of pro bono help as we went through the development process. They also came up with some money to help fund it, as did the county council.
Naomi, are you going to jump in?
Yes, I'll come in now. And it follows on quite well, actually. I was wondering what the attitude of the board was to taking on a loan, whether they thought that that was a risk or whether they were comfortable with it.
I have to say that my board are much more comfortable taking on a loan than they are a grant. I think that's just a history of their background, in that they are local small business people and they're used to operating in that culture. They would much rather have contracts and loans than grants. They're quite suspicious of grants and get very worried about them.
Rachel, hi, thanks for that. It suddenly occurred to me, how transferable do you think the skills that many people build up in terms of buying their own houses and domestic property are to taking on a managed workspace project?
I think that if you've only ever bought a house once and that you've relied very heavily on your estate agents and on your solicitors to actually do most of the process, then they're probably not that transferable, because after all, very few of us, unless we're actually buying property to let, sort of think about subletting and all those kinds of issues. You know, and we buy a house for personal reasons that are about, you know, is my child going to be in the catchment area of a suitable school, and will my view be protected? And it's not about that kind of commercial, slightly more rational type of decision making that you probably need when you're looking at managed workspace. I think there is some potential. I mean, I find it very hard to say, because by the time I bought my first house, I was already a qualified building surveyor and well on my way to being a town planner, so I was hardly a lay client.
Rachel, I've got a couple of questions about the sort of practical side of things around are people sort of tied into the size of units that they take? So, for example, what if people want to expand? And you mentioned that about the music teacher, but what about if people wanted to downsize? Is it quite flexible? And what about things like, are they tied into agreements around utilities bills? And what happens if, you know, for example, like last year, utility bills increased quite dramatically?
We took quite a conscious decision that we wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to move in and out of the space. That has to be balanced against the security of having income, and I think this is something that every trust will have to look at for themselves, about where the balance is between having longer-term secure tenants, but also allowing people flexibility to move. We operate a license system where it's basically, we take a 3-month deposit from them, but it's 1 month's notice either way. Again, we originally started by saying that we didn't want to have people occupying more than 1 unit, but we've tended to review that. I think particularly at the moment, and talking to other friends that operate managed workspace, they're saying, well, actually, we'd rather have the income from people that we know we can offer security to. And that we did have one of our tenants, who was one of the first people who actually came to us and said, could we help them find some space, who are a franchise of a Norwegian company, and their parent company were very wary of them only having a license. They wanted them to have a much longer term lease. To be fair to them, they started off in a tiny little unit. They've moved twice within the building, and at the moment are occupying one of our largest units plus another unit which they use as a kind of demonstration space for their clients, and I think that they'll very soon have to move on because they'll have outgrown us, which is, you know, great because this is a local business. The challenge then is where do they move on to locally, because we don't want to lose them out of the local economy. They're now employing, I think it's 8 people, so we want to keep them in the area.
Lisa, you had a question, and then I've just got one more quick question, but Lisa, why don't you go first? Lisa, I could see, I think that you were trying to speak. We couldn't hear you then. Do you want to just try once again, pressing the microphone button and asking your question? We've lost her completely. I hope that's just a short loss of connection and she'll be back. Just while we wait for her, Rachel, I just thought on another very sort of practical point around who maintains the spaces. Do you pay that, or do the tenants sign into an agreement whereby they pay for that?
We pay for routine maintenance. Obviously, if they cause them any damage, again, that's part of why we take a deposit from them, and they would have to make any damage good. As far as the actual sort of day-to-day cleaning goes, again, we require them to keep the space clean. They can buy cleaning services from us if they choose, but we actually have an agreement whereby we go in once a month and do some basic routine things like vacuuming the sensors on the alarm system, because we found that we've got little spiders in them and they used to set the alarm off, and I was having to go down every night, so it was in our own interest to do that kind of intervention and just to make sure that they're keeping on top of things. But it is a kind of a bit of a balancing act, and some of the tenants are better than others.
Naomi's too slow. Rachel, I just wanted to say something about commercial letting and rent and service charge. Normally in commercial lettings, the amount that you pay is, often is split into a rental element and then a service charge, which is your share of the common bills for the yearly maintenance costs of the building, and that will include things like maintaining any machinery, insurance, cleaning, security, and that kind of thing. Sometimes they're split out, and providers of managed workspace are asked to justify the service charge in relation to actual bills received. Could you say something, Rachel, about the policy that you adopted, whether you split those out or whether you did it as an all-inclusive rate? And it would be useful, I think, also to start talking in terms of some real numbers. I can tell you that the current rates in the managed workspace in Manningham that I'm involved with are that we charge about £7.50 per square foot for rent, but about £9 on top of that for services. We also charge VAT on top of that. Can you deal with all of that, Rachel? And it would be interesting to know what the comparative rates in Ibstock are. I should stress that Manningham is a low rent area, as poor old Bradford is indeed in general for the most part.
Hugh, I wish we could charge that much for our space. We took the decision that clients would prefer to know what they were in for, and therefore we went for an all-inclusive rate. And originally we put the business rates into that as well. Subsequently, the district valuer came along and looked at our space and said, actually, with the changes in the business rates regime, the tenants would be better off if we separated out the business rates element, and so that's what we did, and so they now pay their business rates directly to the local authority. And for all of our units, that means that they qualify for the 50% rate relief on what's known as a small, I'm going to not get this right, hereditament. something like that anyway. But it means basically they occupy a small amount of space. I think our current highest rental level is about sort of £15 a square foot. As I say, that's inclusive of everything except business rates. I found when we did the research that very few community-owned managed workspaces separated out the service charge element, that they were going for this sort of much simpler approach where basically this was you paid for everything. I am aware of some units where electricity in particular is separately metered. Very few units tend to supply either gas or water. One or two of them we came across had separate water meters where water was supplied. And I think that it seems to be a much more local authority approach. Whenever I go and look at local authority-owned buildings which they rent out, that's where the service charges tend to apply. And I have to say that most of those, to me, seem extortionate. And if I was occupying the building, I would certainly be querying, sort of how they arrived at the figures. And many local authorities don't have the management information systems that allow that to be easily justified. So if you were looking at applying a service charge, you would need to invest in management information to allow you to quantify that for your tenants. Classics were people on the ground floor saying, why should we be paying for the lift maintenance? Seems a perfectly reasonable and valid question to me, but the lift does function for the whole building and has to be paid for by somebody.
Thanks, Naomi. A last question, and I suggest that we go to our breakout rooms, yeah?
Okay, so I wondered, Rachel, in Project 57 and in the other managed workspaces that you've looked at, how you make the decision about charging in terms of getting the balance between making money and to underpin other activities that you want to do for the community and providing affordable workspace.
I think we took the view that we were going to be brave and go for a high quality space and therefore expect to charge a reasonable level of rent in comparison to the local area. We went and looked at what was around locally. We looked very carefully at the charging policies in terms of our competition. Our main competitor was the district council, who own the bulk of the managed workspace locally, but we did go and look at some private examples and see what people were charging for that kind of stuff. Again, this was a kind of we looked at some very cheap and cheerful examples which didn't charge such high levels of rent locally, and thought, well, actually, what does that achieve? Because that wasn't what we were being asked for. We were being asked for that slightly higher quality, fully serviced end of the market, and that's the decision that we went for, on the grounds as well that actually that was the only way. If we didn't do that, then we had problems servicing the management overhead. And so again, part of our reason for doing the managed workspace was actually to provide the resource to pay for our finance and admin person who also manages the space, and therefore we pitched our rental levels so that they were comparable locally. There's not much around that's much more expensive than us in northwest Leicestershire, unless you go for, well, there isn't actually, unless David Wilson has pitched his rental levels very much higher, which he's just opened a little managed workspace up the road, and I haven't been to see what he's charging for that yet. So we are at the top end of the market, but we didn't have any problems letting it. And so we took the decision that we were primarily doing this to earn money rather than simply create cheap, affordable space, which there was plenty of that around.
Rachel, thank you very much. What I'm going to suggest now is that I'm going to move people into the breakout rooms. As before, there'll be 3 breakout rooms and we'll have about 20 minutes to talk. If I could ask one person in the breakout rooms to make some notes on the page that I've put there, and we'll try and copy and bring them back to a new page here so that when we're feeding back, we've got something to refer to. I'm going to start sending people away now, and I'll set a timer going so you'll see 20 minutes, and at the end of 20 minutes, I'll bring everyone back to the main room. Jess or Hugh, if you've got anything to add while I'm moving people along?
I think we've got a lot to talk about here. I think that I'd refer you back to the interrogation questions, the general interrogation questions that we've got about what do you think in this case, particularly that you would need to do in terms of strategic planning and investment readiness. I think that we haven't had a classic pitch in the sense of somebody looking for investment, because clearly this is an investment that's taken place in the past. But if you could think about the strategic planning involved in moving a venture forward like this, the skills that Rachel collected around her in order to deliver this project, and the kind of things that you need to do with these projects in order to get investment ready, that will be useful as general themes, but clearly I would expect everyone to raise whatever issues they choose during the breakout rooms.
Hello to everyone, it's Vicky here. I've whipped us all back into the main room again, which I'm sure happened terribly quickly, but I hope that seeing the timer was enough to alert people that will be coming back. I'm going to ask people to feed back. I'm going to try and copy people's notes and bring them to a new page here. So Jess, because you had Rachel in your room, I'm going to ask you to feed back first, if that's okay. If you just give me a minute or so, I'll do my best to bring your notes in.
Well, that'd be great if you could do that, because you didn't write any, so that'd be really amazing. Now, we had a bit of a difficult situation where we didn't have very many people, and the people we did have were, Lisa had crashed out of the system, and was able to come back, but no microphones. Rosette had no microphone. Tawanda Judy eventually had a microphone, but there wasn't much discussion. So we then got Naomi in, and we spent the time basically interrogating Rachel a bit further, which was not very nice of us, but very interesting. So we talked more to Rachel and asked Rachel questions rather than interrogating ourselves about the business model, the strategic planning and the investment readiness. Just a couple of points there that came out. Interesting that the staffing actually really doesn't require a great deal of staffing. A finance and admin person who manages the space, a part-time cleaner, and of course Rachel's time as the manager of the overall business. But actually a fairly staff-light thing to do. We talked a little bit about capital costs, and obviously these are different in different places and buildings. But the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors is able to provide basic costings for capital development. Rachel urged us to go for, if we're making choices in capital development, to go for environmental performance, partly because this can help to keep your costs down later. And she did mention something that was quite interesting about it, that basically when you're raising capital money, it's kind of easier to raise 2 million and above than it is to raise less than 500,000, which is quite an interesting thought. We've started to talk a little bit about clawback on grants and the risk of potentially being in negative equity and having a clawback. But at the end of the day, it was balancing risks like that with the risk of a failing high street. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Jess. I don't know if there's anyone else from Jess's room who'd like to add anything, and if they do put your hands up, but otherwise I'm going to move to Hugh. And Hugh, I've put your notes up on the screen now, which I hope might be useful for you.
Thanks. I just wanted to make a comment on the staffing point, and I'd like to hear from Rachel on this. It seems to me that an awful lot of that needs to be thought about at the design stage, and there are a number of managed workspaces that have smart cards for access and keypads and separate meters and that kind of thing, where it's possible to allow even 24-hour access to the building by tenants with fairly minimal staffing. The point that I wanted to make, though, is this is a relatively small managed workspace and therefore is never going to be able to bear a huge staff team. And a lot of the considerations of the size of the staff team need to be thought about at the design stage. I'll just throw in one piece that I mentioned in our group, which was that because our occupancy fell this year, we took the decision to cut our 24-hour security in our managed workspace. And while long-term there will be some savings from this, we actually had to spend some money in improving our security because we were moving from manned security to a period during the night when we didn't have manned security. And so we were retrospectively having to make adjustments to the building that then impacted on our staffing levels, in this case around security. Rachel, have you got a comment on that? And then Annette very kindly made our notes, and we do have a number of questions. So if Annette's up for it, I'd ask her to put the questions from our group.
Yes, Hugh, I absolutely agree that all of these questions need to be addressed in the design stage. We were quite clear when we began that we wanted to achieve 24/7-hour access for our tenants. In light of that, we invested very heavily in terms of our security system, where we have controlled keypads and we have an alarm system which allows parts of the building, the alarm to be set whilst other parts are not. So that the tenants can come and go to suit themselves. This meant that we don't have security, but we do have a very sophisticated alarm system as a result of that. And it is that kind of decision which you do need to make early on. I think particularly if you're going to have a complexity of different types of activity within the building. This is the thing I see that disturbs me most, where you have business clients being mixed up with community clients, and how do you manage the health and safety aspects of that? I mean, the most disturbing one I came across recently was where there was a children's centre at the back of the building, mothers and buggies arriving in the rain, having to get through a space where clients, business tenants might want to be meeting their clients, trainees, vulnerable trainees possibly also arriving, and managing that mix of people I think is incredibly complex. And if you get the design wrong, possibly potentially for the trustees, a real risk in terms of health and safety and working with different client groups, and also potential risk that you will not attract high-paying, good quality business tenants because they won't want to be in that environment. So clarity about what it's for and thinking about it at the design stage, to me, is an absolute key.
Annette, are you prepared to feed some of our questions in?
Yeah, sure. One of the questions that was asked was what basis, what was needed before you actually took on managed workspaces? What kind of research was needed? What needed to be done before you actually took on the building?
Okay, there are two aspects to that. One is stuff that you need to do when you take on any building, whatever you're taking it on for. You know, what is it that you're allowed to use that building for, because planning will have restrictions about the types of things that you can use the building for. You know, if you want to do the 24/7-hour access kind of scenario that I just described, will planning actually allow you to do that, or will it place restrictions that says that you can only operate between certain time frames? You know, legally, can you actually use it for whatever use it is that you want? Secondly, what state's the building in? You know, is it structurally sound, particularly in our area as a former coalfield area where we're affected by subsidence, that kind of thing. And then what are the operational requirements that you need for that space? You know, if you're going to run an Ofsted nursery, there's a certain minimum size requirement for the number of children that you're going to have in the nursery. Can you create those kind of spaces in the building that you've got? And so we used our local building surveyor, who's a great guy who works for the police and a whole number of the public sector authorities, and he did a condition survey for us, which proved that the building was basically sound and identified the minimum kinds of work that we'd need to do to allow us to occupy it at all. But he also did just a basic use of space kind of study. Nothing too grand or architectural, but how much managed workspace would we get? What kind of square footage would we end up with? And then I could basically apply a rate per square foot, look at occupancy levels and say, right, that if I get 75% occupancy at £10 a square foot, this is how much income the building will generate for me, and then begin to put a business plan together around that. The other aspect is then use dependent, and so it was very much that market research element of what was out there, who were the competitors, what kind of services were they providing, was there a level of demand for managed workspace in our case in the local economy. And some of that was, you know, that kind of good gut community development reaction that you get, that people are walking in your front door and saying, Rachel, I desperately need to move the business on, I'm looking for somewhere else to go and I'm struggling to find any of it. But some of that was a much more considered and researched piece of work which was done for us by the Economic Development Department at North West Leicestershire District Council, where they used their inward investment intelligence and their own experience of managed workspace to put together a much more researched piece of demand, which we could then use with funders to talk about how realistic it was that we could achieve the kind of occupancy levels and the kind of tenants that we were talking about.
Thank you, Rachel. The other question that we asked was, what was the mortgage percentage that you took on, and the length of tenancy for some of the groups that you had?
Okay, the mortgage we basically took on originally £40,000 of mortgage against a purchase price of £70,000. So you know, it wasn't 100% mortgage, and therefore, because there was some equity in the building, the bank, I think, were quite happy to consider that. We had originally a complete repayment holiday for the first 2 years, and then as it dragged on and we weren't making as much progress as we'd hoped, we went to interest only. Once we'd completed the redevelopment, we restructured that mortgage, and against a building value at that point of about 250,000, we increased the mortgage to give us some working capital for other things to about £90,000. And we've restructured the mortgage a few times, and at the moment, I believe, I don't absolutely know this for sure, that they're still on interest-only payments at the moment, just because of other financial situations that they're in.
I just wanted to make a comment about this debt-to-value equation. My rule of thumb is that probably social enterprises can't bear debt much higher than 30% of the value of the building. Now, there are development trusts out there struggling away with debt as high as 60%. Difficult to do. The other thing, though, I think is coming out from what Rachel says, is that think about your relationship with the bank as quite a sophisticated one. To some extent, banks are in business to lend money, and as long as they're getting their interest payments there, and they have, in this case, the underlying security of a building, they can often be happy with an interest-only type situation. So don't necessarily think about the need to repay the bank. It may well be that these managed workspaces can for quite a long time operate on interest only. Rachel, I don't know if you have a comment about loan to value in general.
Yeah, I think that feels about right, Hugh. You know, I think that whilst if you were in a more commercial situation, then you might be a lot more bullish and borrow a lot more money. But at the end of the day, part of the reason for us doing this is to generate some income that allows us to invest in other social return that's more difficult to finance. It is quite, I think the board have found it quite hard to think that we're not achieving any capital repayments. That probably is the thing that causes them the most worry. You know, and I think with a less experienced board and perhaps a less commercial board than mine, that could cause you a few headaches, you know, and you have to sort of look at where the board are on these kind of issues. The other issue I just wanted to pick up on, we talked about it in our space, is that, you know, you asked me about length of leases. We don't have a length of lease. We operate on a license to occupy basis, which in our case, I mean, eventually it could become a lease if you don't have the terms of that absolutely right, but we don't give people fixed term leases.
And the final question was, did the organisation have a sinking fund?
We did, but we raid it far too often. I mean, it is good practice to have a sinking fund. We've had to invest in the community shop, in particular in the last year, in a new boiler. It desperately needs some work doing on the roof, which we're saving like mad to achieve and trying to find some finance to help us with. But yes, you should have a sinking fund. The trouble is, it's a very convenient piggy bank if you're not careful.
Rachel from Group 1.
Are we moving to the last group, Vicky?
And I just noticed that Lisa had her hand up. Lisa, I just wondered if you had a question that you wanted to ask. I'm assuming not then, and I think we'll move to our group. We had a bit of trouble with taking some notes, but I think we sort of felt that Rachel had spoken very, very convincingly about the research that she'd done and about the quality of the space that they were renting, but that the film perhaps didn't quite sell that quality. It would have been interesting to see the specifics a little bit more. And we were really pleased to hear about the strong relationship that she had with the council. Clearly it's extremely important to have those local champions on board. And we wondered a little bit about perhaps making a bit more explicit what level of social responsibility there was, and about whether, you know, for a business of this type, the balanced scorecard overemphasized the social return. We thought about whether a question that we had to ask Rachel was whether the training and advice services, which she mentioned, are these offered at a reduced cost locally, or are they all offered out at the same rate, at the same commercial rate? I felt like I didn't perhaps get a sense of how much space was void now, or what the sort of position would be should major customers default. Rachel, I don't know if you want to answer any of those questions.
Okay, I'll try and sort of work down, and if I forget something, then we'll pick it up. Our marketing strategy was quite local. We were really trying to target businesses that had some kind of connection to Ibstock, and we've sort of stuck with that. You know, we're only 4 miles away from Colville and 8 miles away from Ashby de la Zouch and 15 miles away from Hinckley and 17 miles away from Leicester. We're not going to attract businesses out from those major urban centres to come and relocate in Ibstock. That's not what we're about. We're about local people getting local employment. I think that the board still would like to do some more managed workspace development, although we do currently have a private sector competitor who's come into the market in the last 3 months. Many of you will have heard of David Wilson Homes as a major local house builder. David Wilson was actually born in Ibstock. He sold out the business to Barrett's just prior to the housing market falling apart completely, and has now started a new business with his children and taken on his old headquarters building, of which he occupies about half at the moment, and he's put the rest onto the market as managed workspace. So I think it's quite difficult to think about taking on managed workspace in Ibstock just at the minute. I would accept that the film didn't really sell the quality of the space. I think that, you know, if I'd had a specific project to pitch, which was the sort of slight dilemma I was in putting it together, then I think I would probably now be pitching something which was focusing much more on not just the quality of the service that we offered and the kind of space that we offered, but did have a much more of an environmental focus. Because I think that we do have an emerging environmental business market who want space that reflects their ethos and thinks that what we're about. And so I think that if I was to do a new managed workspace development in Ibstock at the moment, I would be pitching it at that kind of market, and I would probably be pitching the quality of the environment in terms of you know, things like grey water recycling and the environmental impact, carbon footprint of the building in a much stronger and more positive way. Thinking about skills, I was employed by Ibstock Community Enterprises specifically because of my built environment skills. In the early days, we were doing as much, we were as much of a community developer as we were a developer for ourselves. And so my role was to work with community groups around the village who owned buildings. We did an awful lot of work with the local churches on their community spaces about getting them DDA compliant. More recently, I've been working with the local miners' welfare and the local football clubs about changing facilities and upgrading all of their spaces. And of course the big project was the Palace Community Centre, where although there's a separate Industrial and Providence Society that has the lease from the parish council and runs the building, I was responsible for putting the financing package together, but also commissioning the designers and helping the group to manage the contract and manage the funding. So my own skill set was very much about physical built regeneration. Within the company, at the point when we were offering training and development, I had a separate member of staff whose skill set was very much focused on training and particularly on the learning and work advice, and you know, so that was a separate component of our work. A third element of our work was financial inclusion, and all of us were involved in things like working with the credit union, working on financial literacy, but also delivering the building society agency that we ran, which was about putting finance back into the village. So you do need a complete set of skills, but it's about what's the organisation about. You know, and equally, when you're doing any kind of built project, you will need professionals around you. You will need an architect or a building surveyor, possibly a quantity surveyor, not quite so essential. You will need to take legal advice. You will need some input around the kind of licenses that you need and all of that. And you know, again, I've been very lucky in that I've got 3 different types of accountant on the board, one in private sector practice, a couple in local authority one of whom also does some community accountancy. So I have strong accountancy skills on the board, but we do employ a local firm of accountants for that kind of work as well, and a local firm of solicitors. I think it's difficult because the balanced scorecard looks specifically at managed workspace. I think it is important to recognise the value of local employment, particularly in rural communities and in areas which are perceived within the urban context as not having much entrepreneurship within them, much local business, that kind of catalytic effect for small local businesses to start up and to begin employing local people is key for many, many communities, and has just a greater social impact as some of the more softer kinds of things that are seen by our funders. So our learning and work advice, our training is more recognisable by our funders as having a social return on investment, but actually for the people in Ibstock, keeping our high street functioning, having the post office, having the news agent, having the butchers, having the electrical retailers, and again between them our local independent small retailers employ about 230 people, but what we don't have is a good measure of the value of that. Sorry, that's my phone going if you can hear it. So I'll perhaps stop at that point, see if there's anything you want to follow up on.
I think that we could talk about this for forever. It's a very interesting case study. But I think we should wind up and move on, have a short break, and then come back and listen to Nikki. Just before we do, this is an area that the DTA has done a lot of work on, and we have a number of publications, one called To Have and To Hold, which takes groups through the whole physical build process, and particularly I think is important because you do need to engage in commissioned professionals for some advice around how to do that. I thought it was interesting that Rachel talked about sort of green build, and again something that occurred to us in a way of creating a unique selling point in the market at this stage. We've also published something called the Green Assets Guide. I think that these things are all available through the DTA website, but you can buy paper copies off us if you prefer a paper copy. And finally, what I'd like to say is we look forward to the publication of Rachel and Paul's own paper on managed workspace, and as soon as that's available, we'll give you links to that. But thanks, Rachel. I think we're lucky to have one of the most experienced developers of managed workspace with bags of skills leading this session for us. So thanks very much, Rachel. Vicky, would you just like to put us in order for the break now and coming back to listen to Nikki?
Thanks very much, Hugh. Yes, just to add our thanks, Rachel, that was really, really useful to have you here. What I'm going to suggest is that we have a short break now, say of 15 minutes, and that we all meet back here just before 5 to 12, and then Nikki will be pitching to us for 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll have a chance to ask her a few questions as well after that. So if I could ask that people step away when they go for this short break, so pressing the little blue, door icon underneath the participant screen, and then to press that again when you come back so that we know that you've joined us. I'm sure that Rachel won't mind if we circulate her email address so that you can ask her some particular questions if you have them after the session. Rachel, I hope you'll stay with us for the next half hour or so to be here maybe for some questioning for Nikki's part. See everyone back at just before 5:02. Hi, it's Vicky here. Just for any of you who are having trouble with your tick or your cross, your voting buttons, I noticed this morning that at one point mine became locked only for the moderator to use. So if yours are greyed out, you may need to press the button that is 2 to the left of the tick. So it's a little padlock symbol with 3 bullet points next to it. If you can press that one, that should enable it for you again. I think it looks as though we're all back here and ready to go. Thanks to Nikki, who's agreed to be one of our participant pitchers today. What I'm going to do is I've cut up Nikki's balanced scorecard, and although she won't be pitching to the balanced scorecard, she'll be speaking a bit more independently. I'm going to just work through occasionally so that people have a chance to look at it while she's making her pitch. I hope, Nikki, that will be acceptable. If you're ready to go, Nikki, can I ask that you make a start?
Hi. Okay. I've just started with a little bit of history about Danny's dream. Danny's dream was started because a lady with a wonderful son called Danny saw a gap, or maybe a gaping hole, in the market for individuals who want to live at home still, or in their own homes and have the support that they need to live their lives as any other person of their own age. The only available support that we found was adverts in paper that disabled people could access. No CRB, no employment history or anything, and people didn't have the knowledge of how to employ somebody. So you can imagine some of the disasters and some of the horrible stories that came out of that. The other availabilities are joint day services, which tend to be institutionalised, and some people still choose to access some of these, but they've had no other choice in the past to consider, really. Danny himself has a profound and complex needs and learning disabilities. He's a young adult who went through mainstream school, and there are hundreds of Dannys in the city and no doubt in the country, and they could be Fred, Sarah, or whosoever. Danny's dream was just his name. She then got together a community action group made up of family carers with a variety of skills and abilities and applied for funding to start to make a difference. They received $23,000 made up of Learning Disability Development Fund and a £5,000 seed corn grant through Goodwin Development Trust. And they were offered support and office space through the Trust. And they had advice through Neil Berry from DTA, who gave some amazing and valuable advice and support. Some of the aims and objectives were to empower vulnerable young people with disabilities through the promotion of dignity, choice, safety and independence, to create opportunities for the wider community, to recognise and value the valuable contribution that people with disabilities can make to society, actively consulting with young people with disabilities and their parents and carers to actually design the service that they want, provide work experience and employment for people with disabilities, promoting good health and accessing of services, producing person-centred plans that are relevant to the interests and abilities of each person, enabling access to support and advice services for people with disabilities and their friends and families, and influencing the way that money invested in provision of care is spent, campaigning with and on behalf of this target group, researching models of service and building on successful practices, and eventually providing short breaks for young people with severe disabilities in a pleasant and safe environment which will meet their health and social needs. And the long-term vision was to provide a hotel-style campus, lifelong learning campus, where people could stay with families or on their own, but it's not specifically just for people with disabilities. It can be accessed by the whole community, but with the facilities that are necessary. Following that, I came on board 3 years ago now. My background's in registered nursing, and I had some management of nursing homes. We then had a about £40,000 for the next following 2 years, so £40,000 each year from the Learning Disability Development Fund also. I originally started part-time, but it didn't last very long. I carried on full-time after about 3 months because there was a huge amount of work to be done. We registered with Care Quality Commission, which was then C-Sky, as a domiciliary care agency and a nurses agency, and started networking and talking to families and individuals to assess their needs. We've just had an inspection with them that came out as a good service, so we're quite pleased with that, because what we set out to provide was a high-quality individual service. And obviously through that we had to set out a full set of policies and procedures. We're now working with 20 families providing 24/7 support with different packages, some smaller packages and some large packages of care and support. People have got person-centered plans and health action plans in place, which is built up over time. And really, some of these families started with a short, small package of care and have built up on that when they've realised that they can trust and they've got relationship. And I think this group of people have been let down in the past and disappointed with the support that's been offered. And again, I could tell you a few horror stories if I had a bit more time. We've also started working with children. I had requests from elderly and mental health people that really want to spend their money with us from direct payments. And we've done a bit of research into that and realised that we can offer a good service. I think we've become now recognised locally as a premium specialised service, and we're getting referrals through the local authority. We've got 20 staff, both full and part-time, mainly personal assistants to the individuals. We've got, since October, I've had an assistant member of staff to support me in my role, and we've got a full-time admin support worker who's disabled, and it's enabling him to get back into work. The staff that we've got have all received specialist training appropriate to the needs of the individual and have supervised support in the workplace. And both the staff and the service users have support at any time if they need to talk and have advice. They've all undertaken new qualifications, MVQ and the Learning Disability qualification, which we've become a satellite centre for, and we can now provide training for other organisations in the future. We specialise in safeguarding adults, moving and handling, health and safety, epilepsy, etc. All can be provided in-house, medications as well. We've also been offered free training from the local council for any of their training that the staff want to access. We're a member of the local and regional workforce development, looking at creating career pathways for the staff to help keep the staff. I think 85% of the staff have stayed with us since starting, so that's quite a big thing for us, looking at workforce issues and addressing them and the barriers that come up. We've had a great local response within the city. We've just received £57,000 for this year from a Learning Disability Development Fund, 40,000 that we normally had, and a 17,000 extra top-up because we're providing emergency cover service for the people that we work with if their families suddenly goes off sick or something like that. Goodwin Development Trust supply a central office for us, including training rooms, which we pay for, but they supply wages support and business support for us. We've just taken our hourly rate from £10.30 to £12 in line with the direct payments. Very shortly in the future, Independent Living Fund will come into being, and we can up the prices again because they won't have to be directly in line with the direct payments, and I think people will pay for a premium service. We have got a waiting list at the moment of 10 people waiting to access the service, and I've had a meeting this week with local authority who would like us to take a lot of their staff through our recruitment and selection process and employ some of their staff, and so that they can actually just take on the staff from an hourly rate, commission them for an hourly rate or whatever, and charge us for that. So there's quite a bit of work involved with that, but they feel they're not able to provide the service that we are. There's also changing places facilities that have been created across the city. We've got 3 now that have been campaigned for, and these are changing rooms with a hoist and a changing bed for adults, and also a place that people can have gastro feeding if they need to. In the past, people have been stuck in their 4 walls and not been able to access the local community and the things that are available to everybody else because these additional needs have not been looked into. Valuing People have asked us if we can be used as an example of good practice, and 2 years ago we worked with Build to show examples of new ways of working. Build is British Institute of Learning Disabilities. So where we are now, Goodwin Development Trust actually offering to take on Danny's dream so that we would remain as we are with Danny's dream, but have the fullness of all that Goodwin Development Trust can offer. So we're kind of in negotiation with that at the moment. The need is vast. We'd like to provide a respite place within a guest house before we get to the hotel-style campus. And the reason that I've done the pitch today really is that, as Hugh was talking about investment readiness, I feel like we're on a bit of a springboard really to something quite big, and just need the support and the investment to take us further. Thank you.
Nikki, well done. I think that was excellent. If I may kick off with a question, but I'd like to see other hands raised for questions and comments. 2 things from me, I suppose. I thought that the figure of your 85% retention of staff over the period was particularly impressive, and you talked about the training of your staff and career paths for them. This is clearly a very specialist service. What I couldn't get particularly was to what extent you really relied on very high levels of skill, or whether it was specific skill and much more sort of interpersonal relationship things that were actually important than rather sort of rocket science skills behind this business model. So if I could ask perhaps you to respond on that, and I'm slightly concerned that I'm not seeing other hands go up. Please, people are great. People are starting. So, Nikki, you know, fantastic specialist service. Can you comment on the skill levels that you need from your staff? Is it high level or is it specific and based more on social and trust?
I think it's both, really, Hugh. I think I don't know how we've quite managed it, but we've got some amazing staff who haven't actually had experience in this field of work before, but a lot of graduates and people that haven't been able to get jobs in other areas. So are extremely able, as are others that haven't got that experience. But we really train each member of staff to the people that they work with. So if they need epilepsy care or medications, we would train that person to actually just have the things that they need to work with that person. And people normally in the community don't, it would be nurses really that would work to that level, if that makes sense.
That's great, Nikki. The point that I suppose I wanted to make was we heard about quality from Rachel this morning, and you were talking about developing a premium service based on some very skilled staff. And if I can take you right back to our first presentation in St. Cat's, when I was talking about the margins that are available to different business models, one of the ingredients that I was talking about was the skill level, particularly in the people business here. And it seems to me that you've found both an incredibly valuable niche here, and you've gathered together a number of very skilled people in a stable workforce. and I'm sure that that has a lot to do with the foundations of your success. Enough from me. Over to Rachel.
Thank you, Hugh. I loved hearing the history. I always love hearing people's stories of what they've achieved and where they've come from. I guess what I wanted from this pitch was, is this a pitch for the hotel campus? Is this a pitch for the intermediate stage hostel? Is this a pitch for general investment to help to move the business forward? And I guess it was that kind of, I wasn't quite sure. I'd loved the story, so what do you want from me? A very clear, very specific ask, I think, is what I would be looking for to find next. And what is it that you need to move you on now?
Are you going to deal with that one, Nikki? You try again, my dear. I couldn't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me? Sorry, it's put me off completely now. Yes, I guess that, what was the question? Tell me the question again, sorry.
The question was around what specifically are you pitching for at this stage? Is it the intermediate or the full Monty or general investment in the organisation?
Sorry, hopefully you can hear me now. Really, I think the next stage is the infrastructure and the investment in the organisation, really, before we move further. Because there's a waiting list and there's such a demand, the management side of things is very small, and for us to do that, to actually move on without more of the infrastructure would be very difficult. I actually kind of multitasked everything, deliver a lot of the training and support the families, etc., etc. And so there's been a lot put on one person, but I think we need to spread that out now, and really would be staff infrastructure the next step.
Great. Okay, so planned growth and the importance at each stage of taking it one step at a time, and putting those organizational development pit props in as you progress and grow the business. Leslie?
Yeah, I'd like to know, that you've got an hourly rate, £12. Who actually pays that? Do they pay that personally, or is it a social service type contract?
Okay, it's either from their independent living fund or their direct payments. So it goes through the local authority, and they've just agreed that with us. I mean, I think they've got a little bit more give with that, and I recently went and actually put a pitch together, and they agreed to that. But I think they have got a bit more give, and with a bit more support with the business side of things, we might get a bit further with that.
Lisa, are you going to jump in?
That was a great pitch. Very exciting project, very close to my own heart. Just looking at your capacity, I mean, you're doing so much with so few staff and offering so much training, and you've partly answered that with your last query, but I'm surprised you've only got 20 staff as one question. And the other one is, you're looking at individualised budgets. I'm taking it that you haven't got any going yet.
No, we haven't, because we're a bit behind the times in how I think we've got the first pilot coming up soon, and we're getting involved with that one as soon as we're able to. I know that other places in the country that they've been very successful, but Hull seems to be last on the list usually with things like that. It is very difficult because there's been two of us now. I've got a full-time social worker who started from October and has been helping support me, but I'm hoping over this next year that we can have 3 full-time management members of staff. We really need that to move forward, I think.
Jane?
I've seen a couple of questions in the text box actually that I might just post to Nikki. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read them. I know when you're talking and pitching it, there's a lot to take in all at once. But one is whether you think Danny's Dream is transferable to other areas, and the other around whether you bid to deliver contracts from your local authority or your PCT partnership. I wonder if you'd like to answer one of those, and then Jane has a question afterwards, but I won't inundate you with all three at once.
Hi, yes. I'm sure that Danny's Dream is transferable to other areas. We've been working a lot with Skills for Care, and actually we received £5,000 just to put a business model together for them to take and see if they can use that and transfer that to other areas. I think we've had a lot of support through Goodwin Development Trust, which has enabled us to do some of the things that we potentially wouldn't be able to otherwise with regards to office space and things like that. And we've really got a prime site in the centre of the city now. We've just really become, with the local authority, we've just become known as a trustworthy service, I think, and it's taken as long as this to really push our name out there and get people talking about us and what we can deliver. And I think the local authority have been quite impressed with what we're doing. The other question that I see from Jane is the shift from adult care. When we registered originally with the Care Quality Commission, we registered with children and adults in mind. I actually think when you start looking at people and their needs as individuals that it doesn't make an awful lot of difference, because I think as we're training staff as a one-to-one anyway, then it becomes something that I think the model that we use is something that can be transferred to whatever age group that is.
Great, Nikki, thanks. I just pause and see if there are other questions for Nikki. Otherwise, I think I would make a few comments in general about the balanced scorecard and about the business model. Mike, you have a question? Sorry, I don't know about anybody else, but I couldn't hear you, Mike. Do you want to try again?
I think Mike had typed his question into the text box. If that's not the case, Mike, do sort of put a frowny face up now. I know you've been struggling a little bit with your microphone.
Can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me?
That's great, Mike. We can hear you now. Perhaps you'd like to ask your question to Nikki.
Okay, it's not so much a question, but a bit of a statement, because I'm now working with commissioners and in the procurement field. I just wondered whether she'd made a pitch. I think I put it up there in the box just in case you didn't hear me, about becoming a supplier to the LA as sort of a PQQ. I mean, a lot of local authorities are going down this route now, and it's a good idea to tell them what you can do, not just to bid for specific contracts, so they've sort of got you in their back pocket should they need you. It's just a suggestion, but it's something I'm working on at the moment, and it does work for third sector organisations.
Nikki, have you got a comment on that?
I just think some of these things are possibly in process. We've been working with a few people together to actually take forward the plans that we've got. As I said, it's kind of putting the structure in place before we can take on too much more, and we're in that process at the moment. But potentially, yes, we hope to do that. Thanks, Mike.
Great. So I see people are beginning to have to go. So thanks again, Nikki. Just a few general comments from me. I do think the whole move towards individualized budgets and personal budgets is going to lead to a lot of change in the sector, and therefore change brings opportunity. as somebody who's married to somebody with a severe disability, I remember in the early days that I didn't know how to access help, and so I think there is going to be a big role for skilled intermediaries and service suppliers in helping people spend their individual budgets sensibly. Clearly there are some long-term conditions where you build up slow expertise in terms of how to spend your money, but there are others where you're suddenly confronted with a situation and you have no idea about how to access help, or indeed how to spend or choose the right bits of equipment or services that you need. And so I see that there is going to be a role for skilled intermediaries in advising people with multiple disabilities about how to spend their money. That's the first thing I'd say. The second is about the nature of the business model. We are talking about very specialized personal services here. I entirely take Nikki's point that therefore a whole range of individuals can be added incrementally to this process, and that seems to me to be important. It is of course a heavily regulated area, and dealing with the different regulations around different categories of people seems to me to involve quite a lot of investment in skills and compliance. I think the dilemma that Danny's Dream face about whether to incorporate their future as part of Goodwin Development Trust or whether to develop alone is a very interesting one. But I do think as a business model, here is something very interesting where a specific project has gone to a larger organization and effectively sheltered under their wing while they're developing. And an alternative that I would recommend is worthy of consideration to a number of people. Small startup projects are very vulnerable, and it seems to me finding a friendly and supportive larger organization from whom you can buy some services is an interesting strategy in terms of development. In terms of the balanced scorecard on organizational development, just simply the statement trustees, Nikki, I think is not strong enough, and I would be wanting to know how many and who and what are their skills and experience to drive that forward from an investment point of view. In terms of your pricing, here is classically, it seems to me, a case for getting your full cost recovery management accounting right. And again, around very bespoke personal services, working out all the detail of what it costs you to deliver particular services, and then reflecting those in your charges seems to me to be critical to your business model. On the social return side, just sort of finally, I think you need to make more of the savings that you're achieving for those branches of the state who would have to pick up these problems if you didn't exist. And I imagine broadly we're talking about social services and the PCT here. And I would like to see some, as your social return and the information that you capture, savings to the PCT and social services in terms of alternative provision that you would have to provide seems to me to be important. So those were my comments, and I'm happy to talk to you further, Nikki, offline about the balanced scorecard if that's what you'd like. I don't know if you want to come back on any of those points, Nikki.
No, other than I agree totally with everything you've said, and certainly see with the trustees how that would be beneficial, putting that in there. And I would love to talk some more with you. That would be fantastic. Thank you everybody for listening to me.